If you walked into a Dodge dealership in late 1969, you weren't just walking into a showroom, you were walking into a crime scene. Or at least, that's what it felt like to the guys over at Ford and Chevy. You were looking at something that defied the natural laws of automotive economics. It was a machine that offered supercar performance for the price of a mid-sized sedan, a car so violent and so cheap that it didn't just disrupt the market, it broke it. And I spend way too much time thinking about the golden era of American muscle. If you're someone who obsesses over horsepower numbers, engineering anomalies, and the stories they don't tell you in history books, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing about the year 1969. We look back at it now with rose-tinted glasses, imagining this perfect era where gas was free and tires were smoky. But the reality inside Detroit was panic. Absolute, unadulterated panic. The muscle car wars had been escalating for 5 years straight, and the engineering teams were exhausted. It was an arms race, plain and simple. Every year you had to go bigger. You had to go faster. If Pontiac released a 400, Chevy needed a 427. If Ford had the Cobra Jet, Mopar needed the Magnum. It was sustainable only if you ignored physics and economics, which, to be fair, is exactly what they were doing. But by the end of the decade, the cracks were starting to show. Now, you might be thinking, well, competition is good, right? That's how we got the best cars. And you'd be right. That's how we got the best cars. And you'd be right. But there is a difference between healthy competition and a death spiral. Chrysler, the smallest of the big three, was in a weird spot. They had the engineering talent, some of the best in the world actually, but they didn't have the budget of General Motors. GM could afford to throw millions at a problem until it went away. Chrysler had to be clever. They had to cheat physics with a slide rule because they couldn't afford to cheat it with cash, and their bread and butter engine, the 440 Magnum, was hitting a wall. See? The 440 was a great engine. It was reliable, it made massive torque, and it could tow a boat or smoke a Mustang. But in the hierarchy of the street, it was starting to lose its edge. The Chevy 396s were revving higher, the Ford 428s were launching harder, the Ford 4T8s were launching harder. The Hemi? Sure, the Hemi was king, but the Hemi was expensive. It was complex, it was finicky, it was a race engine pretending to be a street engine, and everyone knew it. If you drove a Hemi on the street every day, you were miserable. It fouled plugs, it hated traffic, and it cost a fortune to tune. Chrysler needed something else. They needed a weapon for the common man. They needed something that could sit at a stoplight, idle smoothly, drive your grandma to church, and then, at the drop of a hat, absolutely annihilate a Corvette. This is where it gets really interesting. The solution didn't come from the boardroom, it came from the drag strip. Chrysler's engineers had been watching the super stock classes, watching what the racers were doing to squeeze every last drop of air into those combustion chambers. The logic was brutally simple. An engine is just an air pump. The more air you can shove in, the more fuel you can burn. The more fuel you burn, the bigger the boom. The bigger the boom, the faster you go. The bottleneck was the carburetor. A single 4-barrel carburetor, no matter how big, has limits. It creates turbulence. It struggles to distribute fuel evenly to all 8 cylinders, especially the ones at the far corners of the intake manifold. So, the engineers asked a question that shouldn't have been asked. What if we just added more? Not 1 carburetor, not 2, 3. 3 2-barrel carburetors lined up like soldiers on top of an aluminum intake manifold. It sounds excessive because it was. It sounds unnecessary because, strictly speaking, it was. But in the context of 1969, it was genius. This was the birth of the six-pack. And look, I'm not talking about beer. I'm talking about the induction system that would become the stuff of legend. But here's what most people don't realize. The six-pack wasn't just about dumping gas into an engine. Anyone can do that. You can pour a bucket of gasoline into an intake and you'll get a fire, not horsepower. The magic of the six-pack was in the control. It was an engineering paradox. They needed a system that flowed 1,350 CFM, that's cubic feet per minute of air, which is a staggering amount of air for a streetcar. For context, a standard high-performance Chevy might flow 750 CFM. A race car might flow 1,000. Chrysler was proposing significantly more than that for a car you could buy with a warranty. The problem with that much airflow is drivability. If you open a 1,350 CFM hole in the top of an engine at a stoplight, the air velocity drops to zero, the fuel falls out of suspension, and the engine stalls. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose when you're just thirsty. You drown. So, how do you build a fire hose that sips like a straw? The answer lay in the linkage. The center carburetor was a standard, mild-mannered Holley 2-barrel. It handled everything: idling, cruising, light acceleration. If you kept your foot out of it, the engine ran on just those two center barrels. It was docile, it was polite. But the moment you matted the throttle, the moment you demanded violence, a mechanical linkage physically pushed the outboard carburetors open. And they didn't just drift open, they snapped open. Suddenly, you weren't running on two barrels, you were running on six. You were dumping a swimming pool's worth of air and fuel into a 7.2-liter furnace. The result wasn't just acceleration, it was a transformation. The car changed personality instantly. One second it was a cruiser, the next it was a dragster. And the best part, it was cheap. The engineering cost was low because they were using off-the-shelf parts, just arranged differently. No overhead cams, no exotic alloys, no fuel injection computers. Just cast iron, aluminum, and attitude. When they bolted this setup onto the 440 V8, the numbers were terrifying. 390 horsepower, 490 pound-feet of torque. But we need to pause here because those numbers are a lie. And I don't mean a small exaggeration. I mean a calculated, deliberate corporate fabrication designed to fool insurance agents and racing regulators. Everyone knew it. The engineers knew it. The marketing guys knew it. Even the guys testing the cars for magazines knew it, but nobody said a word. It was the industry's worst-kept secret. Why lie? Because 400 horsepower was the psychological barrier. It was the line in the sand for insurance companies. If a car had 400 horsepower or more, the premiums doubled. It became uninsurable for the target demographic, the 22-year-old kid working at a gas station. By rating it at 390, Chrysler kept the car accessible. But in reality, on a dyno, that engine was making north of 410, maybe 420 horsepower right off the showroom floor. And the torque, 490 pound-feet, is enough to alter the rotation of the Earth. This creates a fascinating dynamic. You had a car that was priced for the working class but performed like it belonged to the elite. It was a class war on wheels. And when you unleash that cut of power into the general population, things get chaotic fast. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so it had 3 carburetors. Big deal. Does that actually translate to anything real? Look, numbers on a spec sheet are one thing. The experience of driving a 440 six-pack was something else entirely. It was violent. It was visceral. It was the kind of thing that makes you question the sanity of the people who allowed it to be sold to the public. When you turned the key, it didn't just start, it exploded into life. The idle was distinct, deep, rhythmic loping that hinted at the aggression underneath. It wasn't the frantic, nervous idle of a high-strung race engine, it was heavy. It sounded like a thunderstorm trapped in a cast-iron box. You could feel the pulses through the bench seat. You could feel it in the steering wheel. The whole car would gently rock side to side, just waiting. Driving it around town was deceptively civilized. Remember, you're running on that center carburetor. It's smooth, it's manageable. You could creep through a school zone without waking the neighbors. But the moment you saw a stretch of open road and buried your right foot, the world changed. Here's what happens inside that engine when you floor it. The vacuum signal drops, the mechanical linkage engages, the outboard carburetors slam open. Suddenly, the engine's intake roar drowns out the exhaust. It's a deep, hollow howl that sounds like the engine is trying to inhale the hood. The front end of the car actually lifts, because the weight transfer is so severe. The rear tires, usually bias plate rubber that had no business being on a car with this much torque, would instantly vaporize. You weren't just accelerating, you were leaving a physical mark on the pavement. And the torque? It was relentless. 490 pound-feet at just 3,200 RPM. That is a truck number. That is a number that means you don't have to downshift to pass someone. You just think about passing them and it happens. It pulled hard from idle all the way to the red line. It didn't have the high RPM scream of a Ferrari, but it had the low-end grunt of a locomotive. It felt unstoppable. This is where the genius of the packaging comes in. Chrysler didn't just put this engine in their top-tier luxury cars. They put it in the budget brawlers, the Dodge Super Bee, the Plymouth Roadrunner. These were cars with rubber floor mats, bench seats, and zero sound deadening. They were tin cans wrapped around a nuclear reactor. They were stripped of everything that didn't make them faster. No air conditioning. You literally couldn't order it with the six-pack because there wasn't room under the hood. No power windows. No cruise control. Just an engine, a transmission, and a primitive suspension trying desperately to keep the tires on the ground. The result was a performance bargain that made the competition look ridiculous. A 1970 Chevelle SS 454 was a gorgeous car, refined and powerful, but it was expensive. A Ford Torino Cobra was heavy. The six-pack Roadrunner was light, cheap, and nasty. It was the ultimate sleeper, provided you ignored the giant air scoop on the hood that screamed, "I am going to eat you." On the street, this created a weird hierarchy. If you pulled up to a stoplight in a Corvette, you felt good. You had the prestige. You had the fiberglass body. But if a beat-up sublime green Roadrunner with black steel wheels pulled up next to you, you got nervous. You knew that kid didn't spend money on leather seats. He spent it on the engine. And you knew that if the light turned green, he was probably going to embarrass you. The magazines at the time couldn't believe it. Car and Driver, Motor Trend, Hot Rod, they all tested these cars and came away shaking their heads. They were running mid-13s in the quarter mile on tires that were essentially hard plastic. With a set of slicks and a decent tune, these were 11-second cars in 1970. Let that sink in. An 11-second car you could buy from a dealer for under $4,000. That's the equivalent of walking into a dealership today and buying a 9-second Demon for $30,000. It doesn't make sense. It shouldn't exist. But it did exist, and it forced the competition to respond. This is the part of the story where the arms race goes nuclear. Ford and Chevy couldn't just let Mopar own the street. They had to escalate. Chevy pushed the LS6, 4544. Ford pushed the 429 Super Cobra Jet. Pontiac built the 455 HO. Everyone was throwing their biggest haymakers. It was glorious. It was the peak of American automotive excess. However, there was a dark side to this dominance. While the engineers were high-fiving each other in Detroit, a different group of people was watching with growing concern. The insurance actuaries. See, insurance companies work on statistics, and the statistics for 1970 muscle cars were, let's call them, problematic. You had 400 horsepower cars being sold to 18-year-olds who had more testosterone than driving skill. The crash rates were skyrocketing. The theft rates were absurd. These cars were easy to steal and even easier to wreck. For a while, the insurance companies just ate the losses. But by 1970, they'd had enough. They started introducing surcharges, massive ones. Suddenly, insuring a six-pack car cost almost as much as the monthly payment on the car itself. It was a soft ban. They couldn't legally stop you from buying the car, but they could make it financially ruinous to drive it. And then there was the government. The Clean Air Act was looming. Emissions regulations were tightening. The writing was on the wall. The engineers knew that the days of high-compression, leaded fuel engines were numbered. They knew that 1970 was likely the peak. They were partying on the Titanic, and they could hear the iceberg scraping along the hull. But Chrysler didn't care. Not yet. They were too busy winning. In 1970, they sold nearly 100,000 of these B-body muscle cars. They were everywhere. You couldn't go to a cruise night, a drive-in, or a drag strip without seeing a six-pack hood scoop. It became a cultural icon. The beep-beep horn of the Roadrunner became the soundtrack of a generation. It was fun. It was irreverent, It was everything a car company usually isn't. Most corporations are boring. They are risk-averse. They are run by accountants who worry about liability and shareholder value. For a brief moment, Chrysler was run by enthusiasts. They let the lunatics run the asylum. They built a car that had a cartoon character on the side and a race engine under the hood. They painted them in colors like Plum Crazy, Go Mango, and Top Banana. They didn't take themselves seriously, but they took the performance deadly seriously. This duality, the playful marketing covering up the serious engineering, is what makes the six-pack era so special. It was a wolf in sheep's clothing, if the sheep was painted neon orange and screaming at the top of its lungs. But here is where the story pivots. Because just as the six-pack reached its absolute zenith, just as it was destroying the competition on the street and the strip, the forces that would kill it were aligning. It wasn't a sudden death, it was a slow, painful strangulation. And the tragedy isn't just that the cars went away. The tragedy is why they went away. You see, we tend to think that the muscle car era died because of the oil crisis in 1973, and sure, that was the nail in the coffin, but the patient was already terminal long before gas prices spiked. The executioners were already in the room in 1970. They were wearing suits, carrying clipboards, and writing legislation that would turn these fire-breathing monsters into shadows of their former selves. The 446-pack was the ultimate expression of because we can. It was engineering for the sake of joy. It was excessive, wasteful, dangerous, and loud, and for exactly those reasons, it was targeted. You have to understand the tribalism of 1970. It wasn't like today where people cross-shop brands based on lease deals and infotainment systems. In 1970, if your dad drove a Ford, you drove a Ford. If your neighbor bought a Chevy, you didn't talk to him about cars unless you were insulting him. It was a blood feud, and for years, the Mopar guys, the Dodge and Plymouth loyalists, were the underdogs. They were the ones getting picked on. Their cars were weird. They had torsion bar suspensions and push-button transmissions. They were fast, sure, but they were quirky. But the six-pack changed the dynamic. Suddenly, the weird kid in the corner was the one knocking everyone else out, and the Ford and GM guys didn't know how to handle it. You'd see these guys at the drag strip, staring under the hood of a Super Bee, looking at those three carburetors like they were alien technology. They'd ask, how do you keep them synchronized? Expecting a horror story about constant tuning and stalled engines. And the Mopar guy would just smile and say, I don't touch them, they just work. That killed them. The fact that it was reliable was more insulting than the fact that it was fast. Here's the thing about the engineering that often gets overlooked. The 446-pack wasn't just a standard 440 with a fancy intake. Chrysler knew they were going to be abusing this engine, so they beefed up the internals. The connecting rods were heavier, shot peened for strength. The crankshaft was a massive forging, not a casting. The harmonic balancer was specific to the six-pack. They even changed the valve springs to handle the slightly higher RPMs. It was a factory blueprinted race engine in disguise. This attention to detail is what terrified the competition. General Motors was a behemoth. They had infinite resources, but they were slow. They were a cruise ship trying to turn. Chrysler was a speedboat. By the time GM realized the six-pack was eating their lunch on the street, it was too late to develop a direct counter-response for that specific price point. Their 454 was great, but it was heavy and expensive. Their 396 was getting tired. They were stuck. And when you're a giant corporation and you're losing to a smaller, scrappier competitor, you don't always fight fair. You start looking for other ways to win. Now, I'm not saying there was a secret meeting in a smoke-filled room where the CEOs of Ford and GM decided to kill the muscle car. That's a nice story, but the reality is more subtle and honestly more effective. It was about leverage. The insurance industry was the weapon. See, the insurance companies were losing money hand over fist on muscle cars. A 1970 Hemi Cuda was a liability nightmare. It was fast, it had terrible brakes by modern standards, and it was driven by someone who thought they were Richard Petty. But the insurance companies didn't know how to distinguish between a regular V8 and a high-performance V8 on their actuarial tables. To them, a V8 was a V8. Until 1970. That's when the high-performance surcharge lists started appearing. And guess which cars were right at the top? The six-pack cars. The surcharges were brutal, sometimes 50% or more on top of the base premium. But here is where it gets suspicious. The surcharges seem to hit the budget muscle cars harder than the luxury ones. If you bought a Cadillac with a 500 cubic inch V8, you were fine. If you bought a Roadrunner with a 440, you were penalized. It was a tax on fun. It was a tax on being young and working class. This destroyed the value proposition of the six-pack. Remember, the whole point was that it was cheap speed. If you have to pay an extra $500 a year in insurance, which is about $30,800 in today's money, the car isn't cheap anymore. It's a financial burden. Sales started to wobble. The guys who would have bought one started looking at Dusters with 340s or Novas with 350s cars that flew under the insurance radar. Then came 1971. This is the year the music died, even if the band kept playing for a little while longer. The mood in Detroit had shifted from faster, faster, faster to survival. General Motors, in a move that shocked everyone, announced they were lowering compression ratios across the board to run on regular unleaded fuel. This was the beginning of the end. High compression is the easiest way to make power. You squeeze the air-fuel mixture harder, you get a bigger bang. The 1976 pack had a compression ratio of 10.511. It needed premium fuel, the good stuff, leaded gas with high octane. In 1971, that dropped. The advertised horsepower fell from 390 to 385 gross, but the real-world performance took a bigger hit. The snap was gone. That violent, immediate response that characterized the 1970 models was dulled. It was still a fast car, don't get me wrong. A 1971 Charger RT with a six-pack was still a menace, but the writing was on the wall. The engineers were being told to focus on emissions, not quarter-mile times. The budget for fun projects was being slashed. The Scat Pack marketing team at Dodge, who had created some of the best ads in automotive history, was being reined in. And here is where the conspiracy theory actually holds some water. Why did they start neutering their cars in 1971, 4 years before they absolutely had to? The cynical answer is that they wanted out. The muscle car war was expensive. It was bad PR. Safety advocates like Ralph Nader were making headlines, calling these cars death traps. The manufacturers were tired of fighting the insurance lobby, the government, and the safety crusaders. They used the upcoming regulations as an excuse to kill a segment that was becoming a headache. It was a coordinated retreat. Oh, we have to lower compression because of the government, they said, while secretly being relieved that they didn't have to keep escalating the horsepower war. Chrysler was the last to get the memo. Or maybe they just refused to read it. While Ford and GM were retreating rapidly, Chrysler kept the six-pack alive for one more year. You could technically order a six-pack in 1972, but it's a ghost story. A handful were built, rumors exist, but for all intents and purposes, 1971 was the last stand. Think about the tragedy of that. You have an engine design that is winning. It's dominating the streets. It's beloved by the customers. And you have to kill it, not because it's bad, but because the environment around it has become hostile. It's like a gladiator being told to retire because the arena is being converted into a parking lot. The six-pack wasn't just an engine option, it was a high-water mark. It represented the absolute limit of what you could do with a carburetor and a cast iron block before technology had to intervene. It was the peak of analog performance. After this, everything got complicated. We got smog pumps, we got catalytic converters that choked the exhaust, we got electronic ignition that was supposed to help, but just added complexity. We entered the malaise era, where a 7.0 V8 might make 180 horsepower. But in 1970, for that one glorious year, you could walk into a dealer with a stack of cash earned from a summer job and drive out with a weapon. You were the king of the road, and the six-pack was your crown. This brings us to the legacy. Why do we care? Why am I talking to you about a fuel delivery system from 50 years ago? Because it teaches us something about the automotive industry that is happening right now, today. We are seeing history repeat itself, almost beat for beat. Look at what's happening with the modern V8. The Hellcats, the Shelbys, the Z06, they are incredible machines. They make the 1970 cars look like toys. 700 horsepower is the new normal. But just like in 1970, the walls are closing in. Emissions regulations are tightening again. Governments are mandating electric vehicles. The insurance premiums on a Hellcat are astronomical. The gas guzzler tax is real. We are living in the second golden age of muscle, and just like the first one, it is about to end. The six-pack was the warning shot. It showed us that performance is fragile. It exists at the mercy of the regulators and the insurers. Now, you might be thinking, hold on a second. If the six-pack was so good, why does everyone worship the Hemi? And that is the million-dollar question, literally, in today's market. The 426 Hemi is the king of kings. It's the engine that haunts the dreams of every Ford and Chevy guy. It's the engine that Richard Petty used to dominate NASCAR. It is a masterpiece of engineering. But here is the dirty little secret that owners rarely admit. The Hemi was miserable on the street. It was designed to run at 6,000 RPM on a banked oval for 500 miles. It had massive ports, huge valves, and a camshaft that didn't wake up until you were breaking the speed limit. In stop-and-go traffic, it loaded up, it overheated. It fouled spark plugs so often that owners kept a wrench and a fresh set in the glove box. It was a racehorse trying to pull a milk cart. The 446 pack, on the other hand, was a street fighter. It was based on the standard RB block, which was designed for big Chrysler luxury barges. It had a massive stroke 3.75 inches, which meant it made torque instantly. You didn't have to wait for it. You stepped on the gas at 1,500 RPM, and it planted you in the seat. In a street fight, which usually lasts about 10 seconds between two traffic lights, torque wins. The six-pack would jump out a car length on a Hemi before the Hemi even cleared its throat. By the time the Hemi was making power, the race was over. And the maintenance? You could tune a six-pack with a screwdriver and a vacuum gauge. You needed a degree in physics to tune a dual-quad Hemi properly. The six-pack was the working man's hero because it respected your time and your wallet. It didn't ask you to be a mechanic. It just asked you to drive. Let's get specific about the internals because the devil is in the details. The 440 block was cast iron with a bore of 4.32 inches. That is a massive hole. The pistons were huge aluminum buckets. In the six-pack engine, these weren't the standard low-compression pistons you'd find in a New Yorker. These were heavy-duty units designed to handle the increased cylinder pressure. The connecting rods were forged steel, shot-peened to relieve stress. The crankshaft was also forged steel in the early cars, though they eventually switched to cast iron later on as a cost-saving measure, a move that enraged purists but didn't actually hurt performance much. The cylinder heads were the standard 906 casting heads, but they were good heads. They featured 2.08-inch intake valves and 1.74-inch exhaust valves. For a production engine, those are sewer pipes. They flowed enough air to support 500 horsepower if you swap the cam. And the camshaft itself? It was aggressive for a street car with 268 degrees of duration. But it was hydraulic. That meant no valve lash adjustments, no clattering tappets, just smooth, quiet power. This combination, big displacement, high compression, and triple carburetion, created a power curve that was almost flat. It didn't peak and fall off. It just pulled. It felt like a giant hand pushing the car. But the world outside the engine bay was changing. By 1972, the muscle car was effectively dead. The compression ratios had dropped to 8.225, the WERS down to a net rating of maybe 225 or 250. The cars got heavier, choked by 5-mile-per-hour impact bumpers that added hundreds of pounds of ugly steel to the front and rear. The graphics were still there, the stripes, the scoops, the spoilers. But the heart was gone. It was like seeing a heavyweight boxer in a nursing home. The spirit was there, but the punch was gone. And then came 1973 and 1974, the OPEC oil embargo. This is where the story turns into a tragedy. Suddenly, owning a car that got 8 miles per gallon wasn't just expensive, it was unpatriotic. People were waiting in lines for gas. The price of fuel quadrupled. You couldn't give these cars away. I've heard stories from guys who lived through it. They talk about walking onto used car lots in 1974 and seeing rows of Super Bs, Road Runners, and Chargers sitting there, gathering dust. The prices were insulting. You could buy a 1970 six-pack Super B for $600. That's about $3,500 today. Think about that. A car that is now worth six figures was being traded for a used Honda Civic because the Civic got 30 miles per gallon. Countless six-pack cars were scrapped during this time. They were heavy, they were thirsty, and nobody wanted them. They were crushed for the metal. The engines were pulled out and put into motorhomes or tow trucks because the torque was useful for hauling. But the cars themselves, the bright colors, the stripes, the soul, were destroyed. We lost probably 60% of the production run in those few years. It was an automotive genocide. This is what makes the survivors so special. Every real, numbers-matching six-pack car you see at a car show today is a miracle. It survived the street racing of the 70s, where it was probably beaten within an inch of its life. It survived the gas crisis of the mid-70s, where it was almost certainly sold for scrap value. It survived the rust of the 80s, when these cars were just old used cars, driven by high school kids in the Rust Belt. It wasn't until the late 80s and early 90s that people started to realize what we had lost. The nostalgia wave hit. The guys who were teenagers in 1970 finally had money. They wanted the car they couldn't afford back then. And suddenly the prices started to climb. The $600 beater became the $10,000 restoration project. Then the $50,000 show car. Then the $100,000 investment-grade asset. But here is where it gets really interesting. The market for these cars isn't just about the metal. It's about the story. When you buy a six-pack car, you are buying a piece of the resistance. You are buying a car that was built as a middle finger to the establishment. A car that said, we don't care about safety ratings. We don't care about fuel economy. We care about going fast. The irony, of course, is that the people buying them now are the establishment. They are the doctors, lawyers, and CEOs. They treat these cars like museum pieces. They trailer them to shows, wipe them down with microfiber cloths, and maybe drive them 5 miles a year. The car that was built to be beaten on the street is now treated like a Fabergé egg. And the driving experience? It's terrifying in a modern context. We are spoiled by modern cars. A modern Dodge Challenger handles reasonably well. It stops on a dime. It has traction control and stability control. A 1970 Road Runner has none of that. The brakes are drums on all four corners, and thus you got the optional front discs, which were still primitive. Stopping from 100 miles per hour is a suggestion, not a command. The steering is overboosted and vague. You turn the wheel and wait for a memo to be sent to the front tires. The tires themselves are skinny bias plies that follow every groove in the road. Driving a six-pack fast requires actual skill. You have to manage the weight transfer. You have to modulate the throttle because if you just mash it, you'll spin. You have to plan your braking zones a quarter mile in advance. It is a physical, demanding experience. You get out of the car sweating. You smell like unburnt hydrocarbons and adrenaline. It is visceral in a way that no modern car can replicate. This is why the legend persists. It's not just about the stats. It's about the feeling of a mechanical connection to a machine that wants to kill you, but in a fun way. The Mopar or no-car crowd understands this better than anyone. They are the most fiercely loyal tribe in the automotive world because they had to be. They defended these cars when they were worthless. They hoarded parts in their garages for decades. They kept the flame alive when the rest of the world had moved on to front-wheel drive economy boxes. And now, vindication. The 440 six-pack is finally recognized as the pinnacle of street muscle. It wasn't the most powerful engine ever built. The L88 Chevy and the 426 Hemi have it beat on peak numbers, but it was the best street engine. It was the best engine for the real world. It did exactly what a muscle car was supposed to do. It scared your passengers, it roasted into tires, and it didn't cost a fortune to keep running. We are approaching the end of the story, but there is one final chapter that needs to be written. The modern parallel. We talked about the Hellcats, but there is a deeper connection to today's market that most people miss. It's about the democratization of power. The democratization of power is a concept we often take for granted, but in the automotive world, it is rare. Truly fast cars have almost always been the playground of the wealthy. If you wanted to go 150 miles per hour in 1955, you bought a Ferrari or a Mercedes-Benz 300 SL. You needed old money. You needed a trust fund. The working class drove Chevys and Fords that struggled to hit 90 downhill. Speed was a class indicator. It was a barrier that separated the haves from the have-nots. The 446-pack smashed that barrier. For a brief, shining moment, roughly 18 months a kid bagging groceries or working at a steel mill could buy a car that was faster than an Aston Martin. The six-pack Roadrunner cost about $3,500. Adjusted it for inflation, that is roughly $28,000 today. Think about that. Can you buy a 400-horsepower, 11-second car today for $28,000? Absolutely not. A base model Mustang GT starts near $45,000. A Hellcat was over $70,000. The performance bargain is dead. The six-pack was the only time in history where the fastest car on the road was also one of the cheapest. That is why this story matters. It's not just about carburetors and compression ratios. It's about a moment in American history where the hierarchy was flipped. The blue-collar guy at the stoplight could look over at the lawyer in the Porsche and know with absolute certainty that he was going to win. That feeling is powerful. It's intoxicating, and it is something we have lost. Today we are seeing a different kind of transition. The electric vehicle revolution is here. Cars like the Tesla Plaid are running 9-second quarter miles. They are technological marvels. They are faster than anything Mopar built in 1970. But are they the same? No, they are silent. They are silent. They are computerized. They are appliances. When you step on the gas in a Plaid, you are requesting speed from a computer. When you stepped on the gas in a six-pack, you were physically opening a valve that dumped fuel into a fire. You were part of the machine. The last call for Dodge's Hemi engines in 2023 felt like a funeral. It was the industry admitting that the party was over. Again, just like in 1971, we watched the Challenger and the Charger fade away, replaced by the promise of electric muscle cars that make fake exhaust noises through speakers. It's dystopian. It's a simulation of the thing we used to have for real. The six-pack era teaches us that engineering excellence doesn't always win. Sometimes politics wins. Sometimes insurance adjusters win. The 446-pack didn't die because people stopped wanting it. It died because the system couldn't tolerate it. It was too loud, too fast, too dangerous, and too cheap. It disrupted the natural order, and systems, whether they are corporate, governmental, or financial, hate disruption. They conspire to smooth it out. They introduce regulations, surcharges, and taxes until the anomaly is gone. But here's the silver lining. Legends are built on scarcity. If the six-pack had been produced for 10 years, if it had become common, we wouldn't be talking about it today. It would just be another engine. The fact that it was killed in its prime is what makes it immortal. It's the James Dean of engines. It lived fast, died young, and left a beautiful corpse. When you see one of these cars today, don't just look at the paint, look at the engineering intent, look at the intake manifold. It is a monument to a specific kind of American optimism. The belief that there is no replacement for displacement. The belief that excess is a virtue. The belief that if some is good, more is better, and too much is just right. The people who built these cars, the Tom Hoovers, the Dick Maxwells, they were mavericks. They snuck these parts through corporate committees. They hid the development costs in other budgets. They lied to the executives about what they were doing until it was too late to stop them. They were subversives in suits, and we owe them a debt of gratitude, because for a few short years, they made magic happen. If you are lucky enough to own a 440 six-pack car, or even just a 440 Magnum, take care of it. You are the custodian of a piece of history that will never be repeated. We will never see a naturally aspirated, carbureted, big block V8 and a production car ever again. That door is closed, welded shut. The future is voltage and software updates. The past is gasoline and mechanical linkages. So, The next time you hear a rough idle, the smell of unburnt fuel, or the sound of a 4-barrel or 3 2-barrels opening up, pause for a second. Respect it. You are hearing the echo of a war that was fought on the streets of Detroit 50 years ago. A war that Chrysler won on the pavement but lost in the boardroom. The 440 six-pack was a lie. It was a 390 horsepower lie that actually made 420. It was an economy car that was actually a race car. It was a street car that was actually a race car. And it was the most honest, brutal, and wonderful machine ever to roll out of an American factory. If your dad was a Mopar guy, tell him you get it now. Tell him you understand why he gets that faraway look in his eyes when he talks about 1970. He's not remembering a car. He's remembering a time when anything was possible if you had enough cubic inches. That's the story of the six-pack. It's the story of how Detroit killed its own golden era, not because the cars got worse, but because one car got too good. It forced the entire industry to rethink the rules of the game, and in the end, the only way to beat the six-pack was to change the game entirely. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the engineering and the politics of the muscle car wars, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. We have a lot more stories like this, coming stories about the LS6 Chevelle, the Boss 429, and the forgotten heroes of the horsepower wars. Drop a comment below if you have a six-pack story, or if you think the Hemi was actually better. You're wrong, but you can say it. This is Engine File. Thanks for watching and keep the hammer down.